So welcome to the first Intermezzo, which from now on will be these shorter intermission-style interventions in between the major episodes of the podcast. Given that those major episodes, which delve more deeply and more extensively into a topic, are published on the first of every month, and so as not to wait for an entire month for the new for the communication to continue, I have decided to introduce these mid-month sort of brief interventions on a subject of current interest, of current politics, let's say, which obviously will not dwell so much in deep into the subject, into the topic, but will be more off the cuff. And for this first episode, I decided to talk briefly, to make some remarks about the recent Hungarian elections in Hungary, which obviously were covered widely in the press, had international echo, rightly so, for many reasons. But in the context of those discussions, I think that some points would be worth mentioning. So first of all, in this election, the government of Viktor Orbán was replaced after him being in power for 16 years. But the usual way in which it's put, and it's sort of exaggerated, right? In the media, you would hear that after 16 years of this sort of Orbán regime, which sort of suggests that there was one kind of regime that lasted for 16 years, implied also that it's an authoritarian regime that lasted for 16 years, which makes no sense because people have voted Orbán in 16 years ago in 2010 to replace a corrupt government led by the Social Democrats, who almost bankrupted the country and who was in a huge crisis of legitimacy because they had admitted that they had lied for morning, noon, at night, sort of was the actual quote from the prime minister of that time. So anyway, the Orbán government was elected and won several elections since with huge majorities. So his regime, he didn't come to power as an authoritarian regime, nor was it basically at the end an authoritarian regime. And here we can, juggle with various terms. We could call it illiberal, right? Which he called it for a while. We could call it an electoral democracy in the sense that the elections happened, but other aspects of democracy were not really there. More like an eroded liberal democracy. Soft authoritarianism maybe, but not an authoritarian regime in the sense that, look at what just happened, elections happened and the regime was removed from power, which in authoritarian regimes doesn't happen through elections, yeah? So in no case was this 16 years of evil regime of Orbán. No, that was an interesting development and an interesting process that took 16 years, in which his regime and the political situation, political establishment, political arrangement changed gradually. So it's worth investigating how it changed and how it got where it got and what it was. And what it was in the end, I would argue, was a sort of a first real attempt to build a post-liberal democracy. But I'm currently working on a paper on this, so I'll leave it for that to dwell more deeply into what that meant. So that's one point. The second point is why was he for so long in power? Well, first of all, because he came to power as a rightful and truthful alternative to a delegitimized government. And he, at least for the first half of his rule, of the rule of his party, Fidesz, he, and even beyond, he has introduced policies that the people liked and wanted, yeah, and that was the alternative. That was a sort of the catch, that he always went with common sense policies, with policies that the people actually wanted, and well, that's what the people want. And two, there was no alternative, because the alternative was either the previously bankrupted Social Democrats, or some small left-ish, center-left parties that didn't really tap into the will, the desires, the sort of the ethos of the Hungarian, of the majority of the Hungarian public, which overall, just like in Poland, we could argue that the majority of the Hungarian society, broadly speaking, and in European terms, would be on the center right. Yeah. So, for example, policies like not allowing for unchecked immigration, like just opening the borders, open borders policies. Nobody wants that in Hungary, meaning in the sense of the general population. So when the opposition argues for the opposite of this, yeah, and you go with what the population wants, they're not going to vote for you, right? So the alternatives didn't fit the general profile of the Hungarian population, nor were they actually addressing what they actually wanted, because they were doing opposition to many of these common sense policies. So obviously, now Hungarians were also dissatisfied with other things. There was corruption, a sort of increasing degree of control of this sort of an ideological group of the Fidesz sort of arrangement. It was called in Hungary the regime of national unity of some sort, so national agreement, yeah, sort of a regime of national agreement. So there was this sort of idea that we would create a sort of a national consensus and we would run a rule based on that. And perhaps a goal of Orban was to become a sort of a Christian democratic party of Italy between 45 and the 90s, or what was it, the Democratic Party, I think, in Japan, which also ruled solely between the 50s and the 90s, although there were elections, and there were actual elections and so on. But there was a sort of a consensus, and there was no real alternative to those major parties, and the major parties sort of responded truly to what the people wanted. That's a very brief way of putting what happened in Japan and Italy. That's what when a situation which you have elections and so on, and it's a democratic system, but one party wins all the elections for these reasons that I mentioned, plus other reasons. But so there was no real alternative that responded to what the people wanted, and the policies, generally speaking, responded to what the people wanted, the Orban policies. Yeah, that's why he was in power. But the negatives started to accumulate, especially in the last 6 years. So the third point, how could he be removed? Why was he removed? Why was this regime removed, which was so strongly anchored? It became almost like a party state, yeah, in which the institutions of the state were completely penetrated by this national agreement regime, the Fidesz sort of a network. Totally, the public media became public mass media, publicly owned, right? State media became completely instrument of propaganda. I mean, in the most ridiculous way, like the Pravda in the Soviet Union. And there was corruption and so on, and people saw this. Yeah, how come that Orban's his daughter's husband and son-in-law, right, and his father became rich people. His father, a childhood friend, became one of the richest persons in Hungary. And there was a reason why the regime allowed this to happen, because they were trying to build an economic basis for this right-wing sort of a party, for reasons that have to do with the previous 20 years when it was the left-wing parties that constructed such an economic base. So anyway, but there was corruption overall, because you can't do this through simply allowing the mechanisms of the market to happen. So point being that the Hungarian people did see also the negatives, but as I said, there was no credible alternative. And two, you put up with things as long as most of the things go the way you want, and the essentials, let's say, go as you want them to go. But in the last 4 or 5 years, the things became really bad, in the sense that the economy stopped working as it should because of the conflicts between the Hungarian government and the EU, and a lot of the money for the members of the EU, especially the newer members, comes through these solidarity funds, and we're talking billions of euros, and without those you're really lagging behind. And Hungary became, from famously always it was one of the best pupils in Central and Eastern Europe in terms of the best performing economies and societies, but it became one of the countries that lag behind. It was shameful to discover that. And people kind of started being fed up with, especially with this control of communication, not control in the sense of that you couldn't speak up your mind, but in the sense of like the public media or the part of the media simply lied, you know, and lied blatantly. And I mean, what people don't like to be lied, yeah. So there was this erosion, yeah, back there, erosion of legitimacy of this government, of the Orbán government. And that's the irony, that a lot of the ways in which his government sort of reached his demise is alike to how the previous government that he replaced reached his demise. It became delegitimized through lying, basically. Economically, it didn't perform anymore, and that's, you know, at the end of the day, everything is economy. I mean, a lot of it is about the economy. And corruption, right? So very similar to what went before. And also he really took made some choices that were, you know, he was very good. Orbán being a very, very good politician, very able politician, which is, you know, it's a skill, yeah. That doesn't mean that he's a good or bad person, but it's just skill, yeah. A very able politician, he was able to usually tap into what the people really wanted, felt, thought, sort of to tap into that and talk to that. But there is a part where you create, yeah, public opinion, and he did that successfully for a few elections, more or less. But in the last 4 or 5 years, he took positions that were untenable in Hungary. Hungary became, not Hungary, but the Orbán government became one of the key allies of Putin's Russia. There's no support in the population for such a thing. In fact, the ones who won this election, the TISA party, and the people who voted against Orbán, one of their slogans was, Russians go home. Not because Russians are in Hungary, but this was the slogan of 1956 revolution, Hungarian revolution against the Soviets. And it was also, ironically, the slogan that made Orbán a political actor in 1989 when he was a young student leader, and he demanded that the Russians leave the country. And 30 years later, he's, figuratively speaking, bringing back the Russians by allying himself with them, taking their side and so on, which again has no support in the population. I mean, you can push the propaganda, but you can't fool the people all the time, right? You need to maneuver this sort of to what degree can I shape the public opinion, but mostly I have to respond to it. And people feel when something is a lie. Yeah? They know when something is a lie. So he took some very strange decisions towards the end of the regime. It became very arrogant, the regime. So it became delegitimized, the economy didn't work, and they lied. Yeah, and it was corrupt. So basically, just like the regime that he replaced. Plus, it was taking, and he was also very fiercely sort of critical and really depicted the European Union as the enemy, which again, it's not popular with the majority of the Hungarian population, because as critical as they would be towards the European Union in various cases, they are and feel themselves and want to be part of the European Union because they are European, yeah, and so that's not a popular thing. So all this ensemble of circumstances allowed for this new force, TISA and Peter Magyar, to win the election and replace them. And that's the fourth point. How come TISA party, the party that won the election, and especially Peter Magyar, how come they managed to win the election? And here, this is the key point, because I always thought, thinking about this while Orbán was in power, who could replace Orbán? And I was thinking that only someone from the center-right, but Fidesz had truly covered the entire center-right, or in the entire right, yeah, of the political spectrum. So how could someone from from a very centralized and very controlled party, how come someone from there break away, have the courage, have the public status, because Orbán was the most popular and visible politician. So how could this happen? And yet that's exactly what happened. It was exactly what happened, that someone from his party broke away from his party because of, I mean, you can read up on it, because of some scandals in which his former wife was involved, who was the Minister of Justice, and she was forced to resign. And Peter Magyar went to the TV station 2-3 years ago only, and then he started the first person to go from this tightly controlled regime, national agreement regime, going on a TV station and sort of criticizing the existing government. And he became, this was the door opening that was needed. And this exploded into what happened in May 9th. And because remember, what happened in May 9th is that Orban's party, Fidesz, was destroyed in the election. The Péter Magyar's party won higher number of both number of votes and percentage of votes than any party since 1989, including the Fidesz party itself, which had won 2/3 of the seats constantly since 2010, and they won more than Fidesz. So you know that was a truly huge blow that they could, you know, overtake Fidesz in their best results. Yeah, but why? As I said, because someone from the inside came out, someone from the center right, who could then tap into the majority of the Hungarians who are sort of, broadly speaking, center right, but who didn't have an ideological sort of a program or an anti-program. He himself, in a way, Péter Magyar came as Orbán came in 2010, with a common sense, popular, even populist, you know, sort of a discourse, in the sense of, I'm going to propose what the people want. And the party that formed around him, because basically it's around him that it formed, doesn't have an ideological identity, although they're part of the Christian Democratic faction in the European Parliament, so they're basically in that group, yeah. And himself, Péter Magyar, is a Christian Democrat, a kind of an old-style Christian Democrat, which is a specific ideology from Europe, which we don't have time to discuss here. But it's basically major parties from Germany, Italy, France have been of this sort of a direction. Governing parties, the biggest parties in Europe have been of this general direction in Europe. So that's why it was so successful, because someone from the inside came who could tap into this general ethos, which is center-right. And literally he became a symbol, although since he was really rise to the fore, as I said, 2-3 years ago, like really recently. It just tells you how much pent-up anger and need for such an escape there was in the broad population, because since then he's gone through some scandals or quasi-scandals or possible scandals that would have destroyed any other career or any other candidacy. But people just embraced him as a symbol, embraced him as a glimmer of hope. And to his credit, he grew immensely in these 2.5 years, as a person, as a politician. I remember his first interview, and now the interviews he gives, and his demeanor, and he has grown. He has become a real statesman, a real politician, which he was not 2 years ago. So he has he's intelligent. He has a true capacity of learning and of developing and of changing and of adapting. And people just took him. It's like basically they saw a flag and they just rallied behind it. And he had a very good sense of riding this wave. So much so that they have obtained the biggest number of votes, the biggest participation in elections ever since 1989, the biggest percentage of the vote, the biggest number of votes, the biggest number of seats in parliament. Incredible. And my final point. So what's next? Well, what's next is a good question. Because, as I said, this was an anti-movement. Everybody who hated Orbán, even people who were on the center right who put up with Orbán but got sick of him, of the regime, yeah, found in Péter Magyar a good rallying point. Yeah. So, and the party that formed around him, because it was formed around him, it doesn't have a real ideological identity. It's more of a populist party, anti-Fidesz, anti-Orbán. But the problem is you can't last long if what unites you is it's like any populist movement, yeah? the truly populist movements. Yeah, they form around something that people get angry about. Yeah, and that's their strength because they mobilize the people. But then when it gets to, okay, so now we got rid of that guy, party, whatever. What do we do next? The weakness of populist parties or movements is that, well, they never formed around a common program. So the danger is in the next, period, in the next years, and it's going to be soon, that usually such broad coalitions that formed only because they have a common enemy, they don't resist, they fall apart. Especially also because it's a very fresh party. It was never really built up from the ground up. It's more ad hoc. I'm sure there's plenty of people in parliament, members of the party who are not filtered carefully and so on. So there will be scandals, there will be problems, incompetence, yeah. Not his ministers, because he chose a good team for his new government. A strong, apparently strong team of specialists, yeah. But at a certain point, the party needs to take a shape, yeah. And the danger is significant of the party breaking up, because, as I said, it was united by one enemy, but not by one program. So I foresee some things happening, if not in the next 2 years, but maybe even so, maybe even as soon as that, but by the end of the first cycle. Then, Fidesz still exists, they will be in opposition, so it's very important to see what happens to Fidesz. One thing that they're trying to do is to put a term limit on the prime ministership, which means that they will block Orban from coming back. Now, of course, if Fidesz wins enough that's a constitutional thing. And you need a 2/3 majority in the parliament to do that. Well, if Orban comes back with Fidesz and he wins 2/3, then they can again change the constitution. The current Tisza and Peter Magyar has more than 2/3 in the parliament, so they will probably change the constitution to put a term limit on the presidency and so on. But the next party can do the same. So that's also a question: what will happen to Fidesz? If it will fall apart, because when the leader falls, the thing scatters, especially if it was so centralized. Plus, as I said, a lot of people got really sick and tired of the Orban, and even people who voted for Orban in this election, discovered that what Peter Magyar is saying, yeah, it's what they want. Because, as I said, Peter Magyar did come with a center-right, discourse with talking about what the people actually wanted, just like Orban in 2010. So a few thoughts then about these these developments. Things are a little bit more complex than maybe depicted in the news, but what at the end of the day, what Peter Magyar brings is globally. He doesn't bring how to. People talk about how to defeat these anti-liberal movements and so on. I don't know about that, but what he brings, truly, in a way, especially if it's successful, is a renewed center-right within the liberal democracy paradigm. A renewed center-right, because the center-right in Europe has lost its way, which is why they have been losing ground and they have losing votes, and to the far right. Not far right, more to the right. Yeah, let's put it this way. And what he brings, especially if it's successful, is the center right that he just told this to his to the Austrian Prime Minister, Chancellor, with whom he met recently. He told him that, well, what I learned and if there is anything I can bring is that to the discussion is that you need to listen to the people and you need to talk to the people. And what he meant is, actually take their concerns seriously. Concerns with, as I said, things like, unbridled, unverified, unchecked, open borders, migration, which is, and a variety of other things that, hey, if this is where the people are, you can't win elections without winning the people. You have to talk to their concerns and address them. And that's what he's doing. So he might bring, if he's successful, a more successful reinvigoration, a reiteration of the traditional Christian democratic center-right. But again, as I said, that's him. The party is more complex and so on. So these were just some remarks, longer than planned, but just some remarks off the cuff about the recent Hungarian elections.